What's up guys, my name is Barrett. I'm the founder of RSP. Today we're going to address the age-old question of should pitchers lift overhead? And spoiler alert, 1000%, the answer is yes. Simple explanation, if we're going to be throwing a baseball overhead, we want to be training overhead. And that applies to obviously any athlete in any sport across the world. Whatever we're doing in the sport, we want to train in a similar manner or through similar ranges of motion. If you look at this from a physiological perspective, it's pretty simple. We have the tissue capacity on one side and the stress from the sport on the other side. If the tissue capacity is not as strong as the stress, then you're going to have an injury. If the tissue capacity is equal to the stress, then you should be fine, but obviously we're not trying to be fine, we're trying to excel. We want the tissue capacity to be greater than the stress that's applied in sport, and then we're excelling in the sport, and we should be getting better. So as we go through our training philosophy, we want to make sure that we're providing as much tissue capacity as possible in a similar manner that we need to use that tissue capacity in the sport so that the stress of the sport is easy for our body to handle. So as that relates to overhead athletes such as pitchers, we need to train so that the shoulder, elbow, arm capacity in a position that we're overhead is stronger than the stress that's provided when we throw a baseball, which is a ton. It's a pretty well established fact that a single pitch has more stress than the UCL can actually handle on its own. So if you had the UCL isolated and you throw a baseball, it would snap every time. So obviously the entire musculature from the kinetic chain helps dissipate that stress because you don't tear your UCL every time you throw a ball. So we want to work all of it, but we also want to train at angles that are somewhat similar to what we have in sport. We tend to make everything black and white in our field of strength and conditioning, where are we going to have our pitchers sit here and overhead press until you can't do anymore and basically turn it into like a Gold's Gym, Arnold Schwarzenegger exercise? The answer would be no. But we do want to train the strength overhead, so we'll try to do that in a few different ways. If you had to put a gun to my head and say, would you rather your pitchers not lift overhead at all or do a traditional military press, I would pick military press. Again, we're not going to be in the rack doing a bar press or standing overhead press with our athletes, but we can pick exercises that correlate better to on-field success and train our athletes overhead in that way. One of our favorite overhead exercises and one of our favorite places to start with most athletes is a landmine shoulder press. One, we don't have a ton of shoulder flexion requirement in this exercise. So shoulder flexion would be how far can I lift my hand over my head without an extreme shrug or without arching my back. Most pitchers are fairly limited here and will lose range of motion about 120 degrees. This is staying right in line with that. And we are reaching. With this exercise, we have our shoulder blade upwardly rotating and protracting on the rib cage, which is exactly what happens when we throw a baseball. So although this looks nothing like throwing a baseball, we are mimicking some of the motions required in throwing a baseball, which is exactly what we want to do. It's also easy to load if we want to go a little bit heavier, but we're getting a really good motion when we're in athletic stance, we're standing up, and we're getting that same motion with the scapula that we would in throwing a baseball. With any exercise, doing an isometric is a very safe way to build resiliency. Going overhead in those more extreme positions or just starting off overhead and making it more of an isometric exercise is a really, really good place to start and something we love to do with our throwers so that we're building that tissue capacity without putting them at risk for injury. Another one of our favorites is any kind of overhead carry or hold. So for instance, we could go serratus carry. We're at more of a 90 degrees with the elbow and 45-degree angle this way. That should activate our serratus and have us being able to hold that position. So like a serratus isometric exercise where we have the scapula against the rib cage instead of flaring off the rib cage. And again, we're in that upwardly rotated and protracted position. We're holding there and walking back and forth. So we have the stabilization of just an isometric. And then obviously with the bottom up position, it's even harder to hold with the wobble. We may go waiter carry where we're going straight overhead, rib down here, big importance there, reaching all the way up. Again, just building resilience of the shoulder as we go, holding that way, walking back and forth. Obviously, the higher you go, the more into extreme range of motion of flexion we go, the harder it becomes, and that's something we would advance athletes to as well. It's not something we would start day one with. We'll even go in a more extreme way with some of our pro guys where we're doing an overhead offset carry. Obviously, having more weight on one side of the ball is going to challenge the core now a lot as well, and we're going to make sure our grip's even on this. Come out, get the bar overhead. Now we're challenged to not lean either way. We have to keep the rib cage down and we have to walk holding it overhead at the same time. So obviously on a scale of easiest to hardest, this would definitely fall in the hardest category. So we've talked about a strength exercise overhead, we've talked about isometric exercises overhead, now we're gonna talk about dynamic exercises overhead. Obviously throwing a baseball is a super explosive movement. Nothing in your body produces a faster limb speed, so to speak, than throwing a baseball. You're moving at almost 7,000 degrees per second with internal rotation there. So while we're never gonna get close to that number, we still wanna do some type of dynamic exercises overhead so that we are getting closer to replicating the stimulus that you're gonna have from throwing overhead. So going from heaviest to lightest, the first thing we would start with is something like a squat to overhead press, where we have this ball, we're loading up in a squat position, we're jumping and we're throwing the ball as high as we can in an explosive movement overhead. Again, it's not super strenuous on our shoulder, but we are producing force and a pushing motion and doing so. It's nice where we have the ceiling here. It's the perfect height to really challenge guys with a good weight, where it's a little bit heavier, but something that can still move and throw the ball about 20 feet in the air. The next one would just be an overhead throw. So we're gonna step, load up, get as much of a stretch through the anterior core as possible, land, fire, and try to get that hip flinging backwards so we're feeling that catapult effect. We want to go lighter. This is a 4-pound ball. We'll maybe go to a 6-pound ball with some of the stronger guys, but we really want to work on moving fast here. So again, kicking that leg up, step, let rip, and throw it against the wall as hard as possible. The other type of med ball exercise we do for your shoulder and training overhead is some type of med ball dribble. So we have something that's a weighted ball here, 2 or 4 pounds. We can do different things with dribbles where we're reaching across our body. Again, we're working more of a dynamic stabilization there, and we're moving a little bit faster, and we can go more of like a single arm rebounder throw. So we're here working on feeling some scap retraction and layback. But again, now we have that dynamic movement overhead. We're having to work our co-contraction now like we would when we're throwing and going from external to internal, and we're making it more and more sport specific with the speed at which we're moving as well. And with any joint or body part, we want to make sure we're moving in 3 planes of motion and trying to include some full body exercises as well. So we're incorporating the full kinetic chain to make it as much like the demand of the sport as possible. So one example of that would just be a walking rotational shoulder press. So we're stepping here, and as I step with my left foot, I'm gonna reach my right arm up and across. You see how I have to use from my foot, so the ball of my foot and my big toe are staying on the ground. I'm rotating an internal rotation of my front hip. I'm getting thoracic rotation. I'm reaching up and across. So I'm getting rotation with the upward rotation and protraction of the scapula as I reach, and then I'm moving and doing it again the other way. So as I'm going, I'm getting a ton of rotation, and I'm getting that upward rotation and protraction of the shoulder blade with the rotation, which is huge. And again, I'm anchored with my foot, so I'm not wobbly and I'm not losing the ground. We do a lot with the Viper as well, even if it's just doing something like adding a reach with the reverse lunge. So I'm going backwards. As I go down and across, I'm reaching up and across. So I'm getting a stretch through my anterior X factor, whereas I'm going down and across with a lateral lunge. As I come back up, again, I'm reaching up and across. We can stand here and just rotate and do your shoulder presses. You know, the opportunities are endless, but again, we're moving in 3 planes of motion and we're doing full body exercises, which is really important for any athlete, but specifically when we're talking about overhead athletes and training the shoulder capacity. So obviously there are 1,000 different exercises that you can do, and there's different progressions that we would run our athletes through depending on their evaluation. But what I want you to get out of this video is that if you're a thrower, if you're a pitcher, you must train overhead. So make sure that we're building that tissue capacity in the shoulder and in the arm overhead to make sure that we're doing our best to prevent injuries, to make sure the tissue capacity is greater than the stress involved in throwing a baseball. So if you like this content, please subscribe, leave a comment, let us know what else you want to learn about, and we'll make sure to get it done.